Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing Game 50 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 3-0. Just in general, this was a game that the Sharks were kind of just thoroughly outplayed. The Avalanche didn't look like they were necessarily putting in a ton of effort to this one, and kind of just clinically took down the San Jose Sharks. There were no goals at 5-on-5 for either team in this game, as Rantanen's was a 6-on-5 empty, or 5-on-6, I guess, from his perspective, empty netter, and the other two Avalanche goals that put them up 2-0 were on the power play. And both of those came in the first period. The Sharks got called with a couple of penalties, a delay of game from Barabanov, just not really the best of penalties to take. Alex True, just a really bad tripping for no reason, and the Avalanche managed to convert on both of those, and so they took a 2-0 lead into the first intermission, and there wouldn't be any other action until we would get to around halfway or so through the third period, where there would be this incident, sort of a collision, I guess you could call it, in a way, between Labanc and Sam Girard. It didn't really look like Labanc did much here, maybe a slight push. It more looks like Girard kind of lost his balance somewhat, lost his edge there going into the behind the net. And McKinnon absolutely took exception to this. He goes right after Kevin Labanc for what he seemed to be or what he believed to be kind of a dirty hit, I guess you could say, to Sam Girard. And they end up having a fight, which surprisingly Labanc held his own in. McKinnon, I don't think actually threw a single punch in the fight, was more so just kind of happy with dragging Labanc down to the ice. Labanc, on the other hand, at least tried to land a couple of punches. I believe most of them missed, but still not too bad, especially considering the size difference between those two players. Labanc kind of small in stature compared to a normal or an average NHL player. Meanwhile, McKinnon, while is not necessarily a fighter, he is definitely a lot more built, a lot more tall and stronger than what you would think than Kevin Labanc. But in the end, because McKinnon goes after Labanc, he gets dished out a 2-minute roughing penalty, and the Sharks head to the power play, where they look like they have a lot more energy because of this Kevin Labanc fight, and they actually managed to score Tomas Hertl, and it looked like the game would be a 2-1 game, and there would be a good amount of time left for the Sharks to try and make some sort of comeback and force maybe an overtime in this one. But unfortunately for the Sharks, the Avalanche end up challenging for the offside, and upon further review, the puck did indeed come out of the zone sometime around 2002, so here in 2021, the goal is called off, and it seemed as though that goal getting called off was kind of deflating for the Sharks, as after that point, there really wasn't much doing for them offensively. You'd think maybe the goal getting called off could energize them, but instead, as I said, it deflated them, and not much else occurred. In the last 2 minutes, the Sharks would get the goaltender out of the net, Martin Jones, and the Avalanche would just kind of easily put together a couple of passes, get this one to Rantanen for the empty net goal within about 5 seconds of Jones leaving. And as I said, the Sharks lose 3-0. First thing to talk about would indeed be Martin Jones. I was actually wondering in my previous review whether or not Jones would get either of these two games in this back-to-back. I thought it was possible the Sharks would call up someone like Melnichuk to get one of these two, with Koshinash getting the other, but instead Jones does return in net here tonight, and he was pretty solid, though I guess he did make a good amount of saves, as the Avalanche would pepper him with some shots, but they weren't necessarily the most difficult saves I've ever seen. This first goal from Gabriel Landeskog, he had no chance on, really, as Landeskog tips this one in quite nicely. The second one from Makar was one that was from far out, and so maybe you expect your goaltender to make that save, though Jones is also having to deal with about 5 or 6 players in front of him in terms of traffic, so Makar actually managing to get this shot through was rather impressive, and it's hard to necessarily blame Jones too much for that, though maybe it's not necessarily a great thing. Otherwise, 2 goals on the vast amount of shots he faced, certainly not all that bad, but that doesn't really change much of anything. I think maybe Jones's fate may very well be sealed going into this offseason if the Sharks are actually looking to try and compete for next season, which I'm not entirely sure if they will. But we will still likely be seeing more so of Koshinash over the last few games of this season compared to Martin Jones. Next, I'll be talking about Ivan Cechovich as he makes his NHL debut here tonight. We've seen in the past couple of games multiple players be making their NHL debut, or at least playing one of their very first games, like Alex True did in the previous one, or like Brinson Pasichnuk did in the previous game. And here tonight it was Cechovich's time, and I would say it was his time in the spotlight, but Bob Booner seems to be somewhere between actually wanting to give the young players a chance to do something in their first game and also not wanting to do that, as Cechovich, while he is put on the first line, he is quite quickly demoted, ends up with less than 10 minutes of ice time here tonight, and in the end, in the few shifts that he did get, didn't look particularly impressive. And so it's hard to necessarily blame Cechovich, as he's just not really given much of a look in this situation. But I guess in the few shifts that he saw, Booner didn't really see much that he enjoyed, much that he liked about him, and so I don't know if Cechovich is going to get another game this season. Cechovich was once a prospect that was rather hyped up, at least among Sharks fans, and in the Sharks system. He had looked really good in juniors, he had looked really good in his first year in the AHL, but he kind of fell off a bit last season, and it looked like there was something there in the KHL when he played there this season, but we'll see if there's anything from Cechovich when he gets sent back down to the AHL, which I would not be surprised to see past this game. Next, I'll be talking about the Sharks' power play. So as I said, they did technically score a power play goal this game, though it was called back on the offside, and because of that, the Sharks end up going 0 for 4 here tonight, and something along the lines of 0 for 27 or 0 for 28 over their last bunch of games, which is just kind of disastrous, as the Sharks power play, at least coming into today, found themselves 29th in the league in terms of power play percentage, which is more or less just kind of unacceptable, right? You take a look at some of the teams down there, you look at a team like the Anaheim Ducks, no offense to the Ducks, but they don't necessarily have the strongest personnel on their power play units. The same goes with a team like the Detroit Red Wings, another team that's quite low down on the power play list. But you look at the San Jose Sharks, and while they're not one of the better teams in the NHL for sure, I can admit that, you take a look at their power play units that they can ice with, players like Logan Couture, a 70-point scorer at best, or at his best, I should say. Evander Kane is a 30-goal scorer. Erik Karlsson was, multiple Norris trophies, 80-point player. Same with Brent Burns. And yes, a lot of these players, as I'm pointing them out, have declined since those peaks for them, but still, it is just kind of inexcusable to be able to go almost 30 straight power plays without a single goal if we excuse tonight's called off goal. And normally in these past few reviews, I've been talking about things kind of looking forward. I guess I've been talking about a lot of these young players as we look forward to the next season, where it's actually going to matter what the Sharks actually do at the start of it. But that's exactly what I'm looking for in terms of the power play. Something about this Sharks power play needs to change. The personnel is not necessarily the issue that can be changed, because the Sharks don't necessarily have too much control of that. They can't do a full overhaul or anything like that. Something systematically probably just has to change, or something in the minds of these players about what to do differently needs to change, because it's been now 2 straight years with the Sharks power play has just looked completely lost for the vast majority of both of these 2 seasons. So at this point, someone's got to be at their wits' end and decide that a major change needs to happen. I don't know what it is. I'm not really the coach who has to decide that, but somebody has to. And finally, let's talk about Ryan Donato. He is a player who I guess was injured the past couple of games, returned to the lineup here tonight, once again taking his spot on this 4th line, ends up with less than 10 minutes of ice time here tonight. And I will reiterate something that I've mentioned many times this season, that I have absolutely not necessarily seen eye to eye with Bob Booner about a lot of his coaching decisions. Sometimes I feel as though him starting certain goaltenders have been strange choices. Sometimes I feel as though he's not giving certain players, the ice time that they may deserve. Sometimes I think he's giving certain players too much ice time, but I don't think there is any issue that I've had more with Bob Booner than his treatment of Ryan Donato. Earlier on this season, Ryan Donato was looking like one of the bright points for the San Jose Sharks through the first few games of this season. He was putting in a lot of effort. He was making some really nice things happen on the ice. And then suddenly, yes, there was a bit of a cold streak for Ryan Donato, absolutely, but he was very quickly, and I don't know why this was this quick, moved down into the, 3rd and even 4th line from Bob Booner's perspective, and he was basically never able to actually break out, no matter how strong he ever looked on that 4th line, on that 3rd line. Just anytime he would be given his 8 or 9 minutes of ice time, and he would make some nice plays happen, maybe he'd even get a goal, maybe he'd get a nice assist, Bob Booner would kind of just look directly past that and not particularly care to give Donato any more ice time. The Sharks have been looking for a sort of a new face on this first line. The Sharks have been kind of changing things up, especially since Barabanov has joined Evander Kane and Tomas Hertl onto this 2nd line. And so it's Couture, Balcers, and a rotating cast. LeBanc had been injured, and so they tried Cechovich up here, and that didn't end up working. But for some reason, I know Ryan Donato was injured the past couple of games, so it couldn't have happened. But why was Donato not necessarily given a chance in this one to shine. Honestly, the Sharks are, I guess you could say, somewhat fortunate that Ryan Donato is actually a restricted free agent by the end of this season, because if I was Ryan Donato and I was an unrestricted free agent after the treatment I was given here in San Jose by the head coach, I would have absolutely walked in free agency, which would be actually a pretty decently sized loss for the San Jose Sharks. Ryan Donato is still a pretty young player. He's still a pretty solid player. I think at best this guy could technically be a second liner, maybe on a not so fantastic team, right? I'm not expecting him to be a second liner on the Tampa Bay Lightning, but a second liner on a team like the San Jose Sharks, I don't think is anything crazy, or at the very least a third liner who can get easily 12, 13, 14 minutes a night and maybe some second power play time. But for whatever reason, Ryan Donato is just not given the opportunities here this season. I hope the Sharks bring him back and either Bob Booner learns that maybe Ryan Donato actually is a capable player, or maybe Doug Wilson learns that Bob Booner isn't the correct coach for the job. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they'll take on the Colorado Avalanche, and it will be pretty difficult to have too much of a worse performance than they did here tonight, considering they didn't really do much of anything. We'll see if they can ameliorate on this performance. Class dismissed.